About 3:20 a.m. on March 13th, 1964, Kitty Genovese, a 28-year-old manager in Queens, New York, drove home to her neighborhood, parked her car in an adjacent parking lot to her apartment building, and began to walk the 30 yards through the parking lot to her apartment entry door. Noticing a man at the far end of the lot there, she paused momentarily. When he started towards her, she turned the other way and tried to run for a police call box that was about half a block away. The man ran towards her, caught her, and stabbed her. She started screaming that she had been stabbed. She cried out for help as loud as she could. Being surrounded by apartment buildings, she knew someone would hear her. Someone did hear her. Lots of people. Lights went on in the apartment building across the street, and windows were open, and one man called out, "Leave that girl alone." This startled the attacker. He heard that, and he walked away. And then windows closed, and lights went out, and no one came out to help her. So the attacker, seeing that no one came outside, returned and attacked her again. This time she screamed, "I'm dying! I'm dying!" This time more of her neighbors heard her, and even more windows opened, and even more lights came on in the apartments nearby her. This really startled the attacker. He went to his car and he drove off, leaving Miss Genovese to crawl along the street to her apartment building. Somehow she managed to drag herself inside the door, but the attacker, watching from afar, seeing that still no one came to help her, came back for a third time and found her at the floor, at the foot of her stairs at her apartment building, and then attacked her again, and finally succeeded in taking her life. During those three separate attacks, over the course of 35 minutes, not one of Kitty Genovese's neighbors actually came outside to help her. Now, after the third attack, someone called the police, who arrived there within 2 minutes, arrived on the scene in 2 minutes. But it was too late by then. Residents who were later interviewed were asked, "Did you not hear the screams coming from down there?" "Oh, yeah, we heard that." "You heard the multiple cries for help over the course of these 35? Yeah, we heard that." "And you did nothing to help her? Why didn't you help her? Why didn't you do something?" Most simply replied, "I didn't want to get involved. I just didn't want to get involved." Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan shows us that these neighbors should have done more to help her. The command to love your neighbor as yourself means getting involved. It means doing something. Listen to some of the Old Testament's teaching on the elements of being a good neighbor. This is Exodus 23, beginning in verse 4. "If you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to take it back to him. If you see the donkey of someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help him with it." Leviticus 19 and verse 13. "Do not defraud your neighbor or rob him. Do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. Do not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind, but fear your God. I am the Lord. Do not pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly. Do not go about spreading slander among your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbor's life. I am the Lord. Do not hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke your neighbor frankly so that you will not share in his guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against one of your people, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." There are many great questions throughout the Bible. Today I want to look at one of the greatest questions ever asked. If we are to know how to please God, it's a question that every one of us needs to know the answer to. Jesus tells a story with three potential neighbors and asks a lawyer a question. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? Now, knowing the right answer to that question will help us to live the way God wants each and every one of us to live. The story of the Good Samaritan is about neighbors. It has all the elements of a great story. There's violence and crime and discrimination. There's hatred, neglect. There's unconcern. But there's also extraordinary love and extraordinary mercy in this story. Our story is found in Luke chapter 10 and verse 25. Luke 10 and verse 25. Here a lawyer has this encounter with Jesus. Now this lawyer is smart. In fact, in his conversation with Jesus, he answers every question Jesus asks him correctly. He's a smart lawyer who asks great questions, but he does not ask with a heart seeking to live a life pleasing to God. He just wants to test Jesus. That's really all he wants to do. This lawyer begins his conversation with Jesus with a great question. In fact, this is the question of all questions that every one of us should ask. Luke 10 and verse 25 reads, And a lawyer stood up and put him to the test, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Now, this expert in the law, this lawyer, he should know the answer to the question. And he does, but you see his motive for asking the question is really just to test Jesus. He's not wanting to learn more information. Luke 10:26 reads, And he, Jesus, said to him, What is written in the law? How does it read to you? And he, the lawyer, answered, You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your strength, and with all of your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he, Jesus, said to him, You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. Like I said, this lawyer is very smart. He knows what the scriptures teach. This conversation could end right here, and the lawyer would look very smart. But, of course, there's a problem. Although he knows the right answers, he does not know how to live the scriptures out in his life. His motive is not to learn. His motive is just to test and to justify his own actions, to justify himself. And it becomes clear right here in Luke 10 and verse 29. But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Now, this is not an honest question from a man who desires to please God. We need to recognize that here. Here's a question from a man who wants to find a loophole in who he has to be a neighbor to. Now, we've already determined that he is a very smart lawyer here, but now it's also clear that he's got some prejudices in his life that are keeping him from living the way that God wants him to live. Jesus helps this lawyer understand what's expected from him and from us too with a story. In reply, Jesus said, A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he put him on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Jesus answers the lawyer's question, Who is my neighbor? By telling a story about a man who needs help. Jesus then asks his own question. In this story, Jesus wants us to see what it takes, what we must do to be a good neighbor. The journey from Jerusalem to Jericho was not an easy trip for anyone in Jesus' day. It was around a 17-mile journey across steep roads and through a rocky desert. The rocky desert between Jerusalem and Jericho provided many places for thieves to hide and attack and rob defenseless travelers. So there's this man who's starting out on his journey to Jericho, and everything seems to be going just fine. He may have been on a business trip, or it may have been he's going to go visit some relatives or go on vacation there. We're not told the specifics here. I don't know what his business is, but as he travels along, he encounters some very dangerous men. He falls among violent robbers, and he is beaten severely. His goods are taken. There is nothing that he does to deserve this kind of treatment. There is nothing he does to provoke this kind of abuse. It's just that he was traveling down this road. The road played a critical role throughout history. The Jews and Arabs have fought over it many times. In the time of Jesus, it was a place of danger, a place where robbers found happy hunting grounds to rob and hurt others. This traveler is in bad shape after these violent robbers get a hold of him. The story of the Good Samaritan teaches us about different philosophies of life here, and it teaches us what it means to be a good neighbor. Well, first, the story of the Good Samaritan shows us the robber's philosophy of life. You see, the robber's philosophy of life is this: what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. They don't care if you live, they don't care if you die, just as long as they can take what they want. Jesus says they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. These robbers only cared about how they could profit from this traveler going down the road. To him, he was just easy money. They didn't care about the traveler. They didn't care about his well-being. They beat him because they could do it. They were violent. They were selfish. You see, the robber's philosophy of life is what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. They don't care what it costs us. You see, these robbers were certainly not being a good neighbor to the traveler because they don't care about him. They don't care about his life. They only care about how they can rob, how they can take from others and hurt others. Christians should never follow the robber's philosophy of life because their philosophy of life is what's yours is mine, and I'm going to take it. Well, second, the story of the Good Samaritan shows us the priests and Levites' philosophy of life. Now, these two are supposed to be the good guys in the story. This is where we would hope these guys are always going to be the heroes, but that's not what we see here. We might call these two the minister and the associate minister. Jesus tells this story. He says, a priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. These are supposed to be the good guys. These are men who are supposedly dedicated to serving God. But they're not, because they believe their philosophy of life is this: what's mine is mine, and I am going to keep it. Now, whenever I read this story and I picture the priest and the Levite walking down on the road and walking on the other side, somehow I just picture their hand going up to the side of their face. Like, I don't see this. I don't see it. Nobody's there. Keep walking. Keep on going. Just close their eyes to the whole situation that's going on there. When the priest, this Jewish priest and this Jewish Levite see the beaten man there lying on the side of the road, their thoughts are not about helping him, this injured man, this dying man, this man who has suffered great loss, but it's just about themselves. They do not want to get involved. They make sure they're not even close to getting involved. They make sure that they're on the other side of the road. They don't want to get close to helping. They see him injured and walk by on the other side of the road. Maybe they have appointments to keep, and they're just not going to let a dying man be an inconvenience to them. Maybe they're more afraid of missing an opportunity than trying to help this man. If the priest or the Levite helped the man and he turned out to be dead, or if he died on the journey, well, they could be considered unclean for 7 days for touching a dead body. This could be a huge inconvenience if something bad were to happen. The priest and Levite may have decided not to help because of financial reasons or fear that they might be robbed as well. Maybe they just didn't want to get involved like Kitty Genevieve's neighbors. Whatever excuse they use to rationalize their behavior for not helping the man, it is not good enough. You see, they didn't hurt the man. They didn't beat him up. They didn't rob him, but they didn't help him either. Whatever the reason for helping, they believed what was theirs, and they're going to keep it. It was their time. It was their risk. They certainly didn't behave as a good neighbor should because they didn't care for the man. They were like Kitty Geneviese's neighbors. They just didn't want to get involved. This is not the philosophy of life a Christian should live by either. Well, third, the story of the Good Samaritan shows us the Samaritan's philosophy of life. The Jews in Jesus' day looked down on the Samaritans, their neighbors to the north. People who lived in Samaria were called Samaritans. To the Jews in that day, there was probably no such thing as the Good Samaritan. There was a long history of distrust and mutual hatred between the Jews and the Samaritans. But that's not what we find here in this story. Jesus continues his story. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." The Good Samaritan believes his philosophy of life is this: what's mine is yours, and I'm going to share it. He knows he can do something to help. He's not going to let long-held prejudices get in the way of being a good neighbor. If we see someone broke down on the side of the road, we might not be able to fix his car, but we could call for help. If we know someone who is in pain, we might not be able to take away that pain, but we can send a card, we can hold someone's hand, we can be there to comfort them. If we know someone who is recovering from a physical injury, we might not be able to heal the wound, but we can lighten his or her load by preparing a meal or helping with other responsibilities. We can bandage a wound. Jesus says in Matthew 10 and verse 42, "If anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones because he is my disciple, I tell you the truth, he will certainly not lose his reward." Even something as simple as giving a cool cup of water can be helpful at the right time. You know, the Bible never shows the Good Samaritan as superhuman. The Bible never shows the Good Samaritan as a doctor who knows all the answers. The Bible never shows the Good Samaritan as a paramedic. But most interesting of all, the Bible never shows the Good Samaritan making excuses of trying to get out of helping this man who desperately needed someone to help him. The Bible shows us that the Good Samaritan did everything in his power to help a person who is in need. Paul writes this in Galatians 6 and verse 2. "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you fulfill the law of Christ." When someone is overburdened, we need to be there to help lend a hand, see how we can help. The story of the Good Samaritan was brought about by the question, who is my neighbor? Now, the Jews in Jesus' day split hairs on this question. The Jews did not consider the Samaritans a neighbor, even though they lived nearby. It's likely the Jews don't even believe there was such thing as a good Samaritan. When the expert in the law asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" he's not really asking who his neighbor is, but to whom must I be a neighbor to? To be a good neighbor is to share our time. The Good Samaritan took time out of his day to stop and to help. Where can we share our time and be a good neighbor? To be a neighbor is to share our abilities. The Good Samaritan had the ability to bandage the traveler's wounds, and he used that ability. He used what he had right then and there to help a man who needed help. He had ability to get him to a safe place, and he got him there. To be a neighbor to someone is to share of your means. The Good Samaritan took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. "Look after him," he said, "and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have." Now that is quite a person. That is quite a neighbor. In 1975, a child named Raymond Dunn Jr. was born in New York State. The Associated Press reports that at his birth, a skull fracture and oxygen deprivation caused severe mental and physical disabilities. As Raymond grew, his twisted body suffered up to 20 seizures per day. He was blind. He was mute. He also had severe allergies that limited him to only one food. Only one food he could tolerate. It was a meat-based formula made by Gerber Foods. In 1985, when Raymond was 10 years old, Gerber stopped making that one formula that Raymond could eat. The one formula that he survived on. Raymond's mom searched the country to buy whatever stores had remaining in stock, and she accumulated a great deal of cases, many, many cases of that meat-based formula. But in 1990, 5 years later, her supply was depleted. In desperation, she appealed to Gerber for help. Without this food, Raymond would starve to death. Please help. The employees of the company listened. Volunteers donated hundreds of hours to bring out old equipment, set up production lines, and produce the formula, all for one special boy. In January 1995, Raymond Dunn Jr., known by many as the Gerber Boy, died from his physical problems. But during his brief lifetime, he called forth a wonderful thing called compassion. The Good Samaritan had compassion for a man who needed help. There are food pantries, clothing closets, places that share household items, provide housing, provide medical care for the wounded and sick because of Jesus' story right here in the Scriptures about being a neighbor. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan shows us that our neighbor is anyone we might meet regardless of age, gender, race, or religion. The Samaritan's philosophy of life is this: what's mine is yours, and I'm going to share it. A religious leader came to Jesus with a question. Tell me, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Jesus answers with a parable. It's probably his most well-known story. The story of the Good Samaritan turns up everywhere in our culture, in our laws, and even in places where people do not know what a Samaritan is or that it was Jesus who first told the story. With such familiarity, we typically think of the Good Samaritan as a parable about being a good neighbor. Jesus defines what it means to love your neighbor. It's a love that involves itself in unexpected, revolutionary, boundary-breaking ways. And of course, the best way to explain such love is with a story, as Jesus does. Ronnie McBrayer wrote an article that describes a modern-day Good Samaritan who lived in Rwanda. Paul Rusesabagina is the former hotel manager who inspired the movie Hotel Rwanda. Beginning in April of 1994, over the course of 100 days, an estimated 1 million Rwandans were killed after extremists in the majority Hutu population turned on the minority Tutsi population. 15% of the population was killed. That movie, Hotel Rwanda, focuses on the 76 days in which Mr. Rusesabagina transformed the luxury hotel over which he was responsible into a refuge for the terrified people who were trying to survive. On the first day of violence, 26 people came to Paul's home for shelter. They knew he was a person that they could come to for help because he was a person of influence. He had great connections. He knew that he could help them, and that's why they came. They also knew he was a person of compassion. Paul studied theology before becoming a hotel manager. His father had also taught him to do what is always right, no matter the consequences. At the end of those 3 months of killings, Paul Rusesabagina had sheltered and saved 1,268 people in his hotel. They all survived on the ingenuity and the creativity of an ordinary hospitality worker. Somehow Paul kept corn and beans in the kitchen. He rationed water from the swimming pool after the militia had cut the water pipes to the hotel. He took all the room numbers off of the doors and burned the registration records so that the roving bands of machete-wielding killers would not know the identities of the people under his protection in that hotel. At one point during all the atrocities, Paul and his family were given an opportunity to leave Rwanda for their own safety. He packed his bags to depart. And it was then that the residents of this hotel came to him and just begged him to stay. They knew they were alive because of him. Paul, they said, we know you are going to be leaving this place tomorrow, but please, if you are really leaving, tell us, because we will go to the roof of this hotel and jump. A better death would be to jump and die immediately than to be tortured. Paul said, by that afternoon, I'd made the toughest decision of my life. I said to myself, listen, Paul, if you leave and those people are killed, you will never be a free man. You will be a prisoner of your own conscience. I then decided to stay. I decided to remain behind. He further explained his actions this way. If I'm going to die, then I'm going to die helping my neighbor. In conclusion, to the expert in the law, the wounded man was a subject to discuss. To the robbers, the wounded man was someone to use and exploit. To the religious man, the wounded man was a problem to be avoided. To the innkeeper, the wounded man was a customer to serve for a fee. To the Samaritan, the wounded man was a human being worth caring for and loving. To Jesus, all of them were worth dying for. Jesus' answer to the lawyer is a story that I hope we all know very well. We call it the Good Samaritan, but we could call it being a real neighbor. Let me give you 9 features of being a real neighbor, as we see in the story here. He sees the need. He feels compassion. He takes action. He incurs risk. He sets aside his own comforts. He adjusts his plans so that he can provide aid. He gives his time to help a person who is in need. He gives his money for another person's well-being, and he plans a follow-up visit to see if there's anything more that needs to be done. Being a servant of God does not come by accident. We may have to go out of our way. The Samaritan goes out of his way to help the person who is in need. We may need to get dirty. The Samaritan bound up the injured man's wounds. We may need to help at inconvenient times. The Samaritan stops what he was doing and he attends to this wounded man. We may need to spend some money and use our own personal resources to help those who have needs. The Samaritan takes care of the injured man's food, his lodging, his medical needs, his housing for a short time. Jesus concludes his story and asks the lawyer a question. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise. To be a good neighbor is to be merciful. I find it interesting here that the expert in the law didn't say, the Samaritan, that's the one. I don't think he could bear to say it. Can't have the Samaritan being the hero in the story. It just can't be. But this lawyer's very smart. He does get the answers right. Do you remember Jesus' description of the great judgment in Matthew 25? How did he describe those on his right who would inherit his blessings? He said in verses 35 and 36, I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in, naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Remember how they asked him in verses 37 and 30 through 39? Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? Jesus' answer is in verse 40. He said, truly I say to you, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me. We serve Christ when we serve others. We have a responsibility to be like the Good Samaritan, help those people who are beat up and dying in the ditches of everyday life. Every one of us has experienced or are experiencing the pain of life's brutal punches and feel ambushed and mugged and left to die in the ditch with people just walking right past us. Literally or figuratively, every one of us here is in the ditch or has been in the ditch or will likely be in the ditch. We need to change our view towards those who need rescued. The story of the Good Samaritan teaches us about people's philosophies of life. The Good Samaritan focused on what he could do for the beaten man. I encourage everyone here to do everything in our power to be a good neighbor, to show mercy. Jesus is our Good Samaritan. When sin beats us up and takes away everything we have and leaves us lying half down on the side of the road, Jesus is there to help us. Jesus came down from heaven and died on the cross and rose again to give us hope. It was through Christ's death, burial, and resurrection that we have the hope of being rescued from the consequences of our sins. God loves us, and he proves it by showing mercy. I want to encourage you to be a good neighbor and to show mercy. And if you're one who is not yet a Christian, you need to realize that you need God's mercy. You need the mercy that only comes through Jesus because of his death, burial, and resurrection. I encourage you, if you are not yet a Christian, you need to realize you need that mercy that can only come because of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. If you're not a Christian yet today and you'd like to know more about becoming a Christian, just come forward and as we stand and sing our next song.